back. I have a confession to make. I usually do, I perform for a lot of colleges and corporate events, and I usually do 50 minutes of comedy, and then I do 10 minutes of serious stuff, and I think of it as like the pill that you put inside the ball of meat that you feed to the dog. But you're just getting the pill now. I heard a bunch of you are vegetarians. You're probably offended by the analogy. So I want to go back to the slide that hopefully will be showing up any minute now. There it is. I want to go back to this example and this footnote about trade making everyone worse off, because it's actually a real example in this footnote. It is possible in a very made-up economics model sort of way to have a situation where trade makes everyone worse off. And since that relates to the serious work that I do with climate change and carbon taxes and stuff like this, I want to talk you through this example real quick. So, made-up story about these three people, orange, pink, and blue. Orange, pink, and blue all live in a small town. The small town has an air pollution problem, so think like Beijing, but with three people. And maybe these people are Americans because they each have a garage that's full of stuff that they don't use. All right, so now we're going to see some trades. So first, orange is going to sell a lawnmower to pink, and we can imagine that they each get $100 in value from that trade. Orange sells a lawnmower for $100 that was sitting unused in her garage. Pink would be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100, so she gets $100 in net benefits. Okay, but when pink starts using that lawnmower, lawnmowers create some air pollution. All right, hopefully you can see a little bit of haze around the town. And like I said, made-up economic story. Maybe we can monetize the health impacts of the air pollution, right? Hospital room visits and stuff like that. Maybe at $80 per person. Not just for orange and pink, but also for blue. So the impact on blue is what economists call a negative externality. Right? But note that orange and pink, they may not know about blue or care about blue, and they each get $20 in net benefits, so that trade still makes sense to them. So now I'll tell you a similar story about pink selling a snowblower to blue. They each get $100 in benefits. Pink sells a snowblower that was sitting in her garage. Blue would be willing to pay $200. She only has to pay $100, so she gets $100 in net benefits. But when blue starts using that snowblower, air pollution gets a little worse, maybe an additional $80 in healthcare costs for everyone. And now you just complete the circle, right? Blue is going to sell a leaf blower to orange. They get $100 in benefits. Air pollution gets worse, an additional $80 in healthcare costs for everyone. And now if you just add up any one of these columns, right, you see that after all three of those trades together, everybody ends up at minus 40. Right, so this is the tragedy of the commons, the prisoner's dilemma, if you're familiar with these ideas from an economics or environmental studies class. Right, and the economic idea here is that each person's trades are individually rational. If you ask any of these people if they want to take back any of the trades that they made, they'll say no, because each trade they make leaves them $20 better off, but altogether the trades end up hurting everybody. If you want to belabor the point and make a connection to climate change, you could, I don't know, like label the people. Right? And this is in very broad strokes what economists are concerned about when it comes to climate change. Now, like I said, I do a lot of talks for colleges and corporate events and some groups that are a little more conservative than the crowd here today. But I'm going to do the same stuff that I do. I'm going to do for you the same stuff that I do for them, which is sort of a very brief intro about climate change and sort of stuff that I think is important to know. One is that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody doubts this. Almost nobody doubts that it's primarily caused by human activity, burning fossil fuels and deforestation. All right, then we have this hypothesis that says that if carbon concentrations in the atmosphere go up, then global temperatures are going to go up. So we can run the experiment, as we've been doing for the last couple hundred years, and here are the results of the experiment. These are red bars are 10-year averages going up through the 1970s, starting at the 1880s, going up through the 1970s, and then there's the 10-year average for the 1980s, there's the 1990s, there's the 2000s, there's the first couple years of the current decade for what it's worth. So temperature's going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. If there are folks who don't happen to believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, it's okay, I find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems in general, which is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation and the development of new technologies and all the things that I at least love about capitalism. Right? So what I work on as an economist, as an environmental economist, is using the power of capitalism and the tools of economics to protect the environment. And how do we do that? There are a couple policy tools to talk about. One of them is a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system. But the point of both of those policies is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part where people stop laughing. Because it's hard to make the case that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this, but there is a side benefit other than like saving the planet. Right? And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, then you generate a pile of revenue. And you can do all sorts of things with that revenue. I'm sure you all have your own ideas about what the government could do with a pile of revenue, but the idea that I go around talking to folks about and working on is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting, and the idea is that we should be taxing things we want less of instead of taxing things we want more of. Right? So right now we have taxes on income and savings and investment and payroll, and we like all those things, right? And we want more of them. So environmental tax reform is about having lower taxes on those things and making up the revenue with taxes on things that we want less of, like carbon emissions. Okay, and this is where I find common ground, even with folks who don't believe in climate science. So George Will, who's a columnist for the Washington Post, he's a pretty prominent climate skeptic. He came to one of my classes once. He doesn't believe humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing the payroll tax, the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it, because he hates the payroll tax. He actually said he would support replacing the payroll tax with a yogurt tax. But I said, let's stick with the carbon tax, right? Because I hate the payroll tax also, right? Especially with unemployment at 8.5%. And you know what? Like Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore said we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. But that's okay. People across the political spectrum, certainly economists across the political spectrum, from lefty folks like Paul Krugman to folks on the right like Greg Mankiw and Art Laffer, think that this is a great idea. And there's even a place it's done in. So just to our north up in British Columbia, they have implemented a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I think it's probably the best climate policy in the world. Over a couple of years, it brings in $3.5 billion or so. And all of that money is being used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. Right, there's an offset for low-income households, which is a very smart element to deal with the regressivity of the policy. BC now claims to have the lowest corporate income tax rate in the G7. Right, a very attractive policy that was implemented by actually a right-of-center premier up in British Columbia. I'm working now with this policy. Actually, I played a very small role along with folks that I work with at Sightline Institute here in town on actually making this policy happen in British Columbia. We sort of planted a seed that, well, everybody likes to take credit for good stuff, so we'll take credit for it too. But we planted a seed with a book called Tax Shift that I worked on with Alan Durning many years ago, and we're still at it. We're working on advancing this idea, in particular here in Washington State. So let me just give you a sense of how a BC-style carbon tax would look in Washington State. Carbon emissions in Washington State from fossil fuels may be 85 million tons of CO2 per year. So if you had the same tax that they have in British Columbia, July 1st, it'll go up to its maximum rate, which is $30 per ton of CO2. So that's 30 cents a gallon of gasoline, 3 cents a kilowatt hour of coal-fired power, 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour of natural gas-fired power. If you had that same tax in Washington State, you would generate maybe $2.3 billion a year in revenue. There would be a small reduction in carbon emissions. It would get larger in the long term. Right? And that $375 per person is the incentive that individuals have to think about what kind of car am I driving, how far do I live from work, is my home insulated, and businesses have those same sort of incentives to think about, in particular, a lot of the policies that you've heard about earlier in the day, right? A lot of the things, whether it's energy efficient buildings, the stuff from Rocky Mountain Institute, efficiency, a lot of those ideas become more attractive the higher energy prices go, that fossil fuel energy prices go. Okay. What could you do with $2.3 billion a year in Washington State? Just to put it in perspective, you could cut the property tax in the state by a quarter, right? Or you could reduce business taxes in the state. You could also fund the working families credit to offset impacts on low-income households. And so there are ways to do this in a revenue-neutral way that could appeal to people across the political spectrum. So what I'm working on with Sightline and also this group called Carbon Washington, carbonwa.org, that I'm active with, is we are actively pushing this idea in Washington State, and we encourage you to join our efforts, because we think this is really, when I told that Sarah Palin joke, A lot of people laughed at the Sarah Palin joke, right? But if we're going to actually do stuff in the climate world, it helps to do stuff in a bipartisan way. Right? And it helps to do stuff with people who are not going to laugh at Sarah Palin jokes. And a lot of the concern, I think, coming from folks on the right side of the political spectrum is about growing the size of government. And so what revenue-neutral carbon taxes, what revenue-neutral tax reform and environmental tax reform is about is finding a way to deal with environmental problems without growing the size of government. Right? So it's not about making government bigger or smaller, it's about changing the way that our tax system works and trying to make it more efficient and help us achieve our environmental goals. Thank you very much.